Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 3, Episode 3. I'm Alex Howe, and for this episode, I have another interview recorded with an expert in the field, and we had a lot of fun with it, so let's dive right in. In this interview, I am speaking with Dr. Cameron Kunzelman on the subject of science fiction in video games. And yes, I have covered that topic before, but that was not from a scholarly perspective. Dr. Kunzelman received a PhD in moving image studies from Georgia State University. He is now an assistant professor of communication studies at Mercer University, where he studies the relationship between people and media, especially through science fiction. And he has written several books about the relationship between gaming, philosophy, and culture. Dr. Cameron, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So I do have to ask, moving image studies, is that a modern version of film studies?
No. Well, it's in the mix. A hard no. I gut check said no, but it's in the mix. I did a lot of film work when I was in graduate school. When I started my program at Georgia State, we were part of the communication department. And so my weirdly enough, my PhD is in communication with kind of a focus or a specialization in moving image studies. And so I have a broader comm degree that, kind of honed into a weird melange of visual theory, visual studies, visual culture studies, cultural studies, film studies, game studies, new media, and then the kind of media philosophy background that informs a lot of that. So it was a pretty weird program, especially looking at the world. Once you get out of graduate school and you start comparing it to what other people are up to, it was pretty weird, but deeply influential. And now that program is part of the School of Film, Media, and Theater at Georgia State, so it's no longer officially part of the comm program, I believe. But so if you go there now, you'll get a slightly different experience to what I had. But yeah, it was an experience that prepared me to do some disciplinary work in comm studies, but also some very interdisciplinary work, especially around what objects I looked at. So I wrote a dissertation there that was on theories of human finitude as expressed through media. So how do we think about endings and lacks of endings in some ways too? So I've never returned to that work. I kind of burned out on it, but it prepped me to think kind of capaciously about things in the world. And in the time after that, I've really concentrated in on being a game studies scholar and a science fiction scholar. Those are the kind of two predominant things I engage with and think through. And it really prepared me to do that stuff because being a game studies scholar and being a science fiction scholar requires you to kind of look at a lot of different formations in the world and a lot of different ways of thinking.
Okay. So do you have any background as an actual gamer?
Yeah, the whole time I was in graduate school, I was a writer for various different websites and I don't know, publications. So, I spent a year working for Kotaku. I was at Paste for a long time. I was the editor at large there, Paste Games specifically. I was the editor at large there for a few years. And I've done freelance for, I was a columnist at Waypoint, which was Vice's long running video game publication or video game vertical. And I've done freelance for lots and lots of places as well. So I always kind of had the realization or the I don't know, reality in the back of my head that maybe academia wouldn't work out, so I'd have to figure out some other thing. And so I wrote about games for a very long time, and I continued to write about games. And so I played lots and lots of games, basically from 2012-ish, 2013-ish, up until last year. Last year was the first year I broke this record, but I played about 200 games a year, every year that whole time. And doesn't mean beating or completing or whatever, putting some of those games I put 20 minutes into, but I sampled pretty heavily across lots and lots of games. And that was really important to me then and remains very important to me now. I really like the idea of being able to speak capaciously across video game examples when I'm writing about games or talking about them. I think being kind of fluent in it matters a lot to me as an inroad into the discipline of talking about games.
When I was in college, I might have sampled that heavily across Flash games, but that's as far as I ever got into it.
Yeah, hey, Flash games are real. There was I was on the podcast the other day with my co-podcaster Michael Lutz, and I think we were talking about it. I can't remember. I think he and I were talking about we were talking about Flash games and how I played a million Flash games. Yeah, back at the grand age of Flash, but I also have no nostalgia for it. Like I don't need to return to Flash games at all. And it's a very interesting feeling in my heart where it's like I'm glad I did it. I'm glad I played like 1,000 tower defense games or like little stick figure killing games or whatever. But I never need to go back.
I've gone back to a couple of them. A couple of them have had pretty good re-releases on Steam.
Yeah. I think that's actually how we ended up talking about it. Is like there's a few of those. I was I don't know if it was actually a Flash game. It was kind of like slightly more involved, but I was a big Line Rider fan back when that was out.
That's still around.
Yeah, people are still playing that and making like really interesting stuff. So yeah, those are great.
So, what is the focus of your current research?
Yeah, so I'm working on several things concurrently right now, which is a that's always
Mm.
a horrifying statement, I have to say. But so I wrote a dissertation a few years ago. I think I defended in 2019, or 2020, something like that. That was on human finitude in media. And then I very quickly realized that I did not want to think about that for a long time afterward. I was like, I don't want to return to this. And so I had the opportunity to write a book for De Gruyter in their Video Games in the Humanities series on science fiction games. So I wrote The World is Born from Zero, which is a book on speculation, like what is speculation, how does it work, how do we think speculation, and then video games. And then basically arguing in that book that video games have their own kind of capacities for speculation, and they might actually be interesting to look at in their specific form because of their kind of mechanical properties. So the way that game mechanics work is heavily dependent on speculation as a kind of human capacity. So I did that, and I think most human beings would then go on to like continue working in that realm. And I've continued to writing science fiction stuff and being engaged in science fiction objects, but I've kind of taken this weird jag out to the side to write kind of I don't even know if there's a phrase for it yet, which is partially what I'm trying to think through, which is like big game books. And by big games, I mean I've just completed a complete last draft of a book on Assassin's Creed for the University of Minnesota Press, and it is a book about the franchise of Assassin's Creed, not a single game, but 15 years of games, 16 years of games now. And it's a big weird book that ultimately looks at what for any given player would be thousands of hours of gameplay and tries to hopefully successfully analyzes it from a kind of structural perspective. So looking at the way that it readdresses certain topics. So there's a chapter on the animus as a science fiction mechanism that allows us to travel through time in order to kind of stakes and benefits to that form of time travel that franchise engages with. There's actually a couple chapters that tap pretty heavily into conspiracies and media and how media forms interact with the way that we think about conspiracy theories, and the Assassin's Creed games are all about that. And then there's some specific chapters that dive into very specific games like Black Flag or the Assassin's Creed 2 trilogy or Valhalla. I'm trying to remember all the things. And so I wrote a book about a game franchise, which as far as I know, there is not another, no one's done that yet. And I'm not saying that like, oh, it's beneficial for novelty. But I discovered while doing it that it's extremely hard. It's like very, very hard. And I feel certain that when it comes out, people are going to be very, my hope is that people will be very excited about it, but also will be like, why is my favorite game not spoken about at length in this, 220 page book that's covering 15 years of games? And so it's a weird thing. And then the thing I'm working on right now, and the thing I'm like doing interviews for and researching this summer, and with a hopeful submission date fairly soon, is a book on Magic the Gathering. And kind of thinking through the way that game has been managed over the years, and the way that Wizards of the Coast and its fans and its kind of critical community all contribute to the manipulation and management of this big, weird, gamey looking object. So that's all to say. I've gone from science fiction pretty explicitly and delimited to science fiction and fantasy and genre generally being an element of these big, ropey, complex, mega objects that I'm dealing with. And hopefully the next thing I work on will not be as hard.
That's interesting, the direction you've taken with your research, including your dissertation, finitude in games, and then speculation in games, and then a deep dive into a franchise, because that is the sort of thing, all those are the sorts of things I associate with video essays on YouTube.
Yeah.
And I could name about 3 specific YouTubers who would make videos on exactly that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think part of it is that I was a part of the video game criticism world, whatever, on the internet that predated the YouTube video essay, right? Or at least the rapid expansion. I think that those essays have vastly overtaken the kind of work that I and many, many other people are involved in. And you can, of course, still read that work, right? You can go to Aftermath, or you could go to Bullet Points Monthly, or you can listen to Abnormal Mapping, right? Like, there are a lot of people still doing that stuff around games. But the video essay has become the dominant form of like cultural criticism for video games in a pretty big way. And I like to think that on some of those people, if not me, then the movement I was a part of, especially being a part of Waypoint or writing for Polygon or things like that, or Kotaku, even that the people who worked at those sites, who were part of a cohort with me, I think they were heavily influential on the kind of philosophical or theoretical perspectives that a lot of YouTubers do. And I've got good relationships with some of those people too. I think I'm going to be in a Jacob Geller video coming out fairly soon. I had to read some quotes for Jacob the other day, so maybe that'll show up. And so yes, but my answer is yeah, I think so. I think that definitely the kind of interest that I have on the like kind of cultural theory side, as well as the public facing work, as opposed to the academic facing work, right? But the very broad public facing stuff, a lot of us used to do that for a long time, and that's mostly moved over to the video essay universe.
So on this podcast, I'm interested in how gaming has been a part of the history of science fiction. And of course, science fiction and gaming have been intertwined going all the way back. In my previous episode on the topic, I noted that the first ever computer game that was made for fun and not as a demo was Space War in 1962. And it was a sci-fi game, and that's probably because the only people with the ability and opportunity to create a computer game at the time were grad students at MIT.
Yeah, absolutely. I write about this in The World is Born from Zero, right? That there is some weird thing that's going on there. And it's not even just that it's like, nerds at MIT in the model train club, right? Making the thing. It's also that they're all reading space opera, right? And so I'm blanking on who the specific space opera author is. I should have reviewed it in my book beforehand, but they were all reading the same space opera work, and they are then translating that or conceptually maneuvering some of that into the video game form. So yeah, absolutely. It goes all the way back. And there's the kind of flip side too, which I'm not an expert in whatsoever, but there are a couple books on, and certainly some essays where games have been hugely important for science fiction, right? As a genre, going much further back than that, in the sense that lots of authors have used games as a kind of allegory or metaphor or a plot device, right? Gladiatorial combat, pseudo Olympics in space, that kind of stuff. That showed up pretty regularly in the pulps, and then continued to show up all the way up through the moment where video games actually emerged. So yeah, there's a huge cross-pollination between the genre or the mode of science fiction and the medium of the video game, for sure. And like I said, I wrote a little bit about that in The World is Born from Zero. And there's another book. It's called Video Games in Science Fiction, I believe, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but it's in it's in McFarlane's video game series. I'm just blanking on the author's name right now, and that's the opposite. It's the where do video games show up in the literature, or where do games show up in the literature of science fiction? And that's a fascinating book. But there is, I think, way more to be written about, and I would love for someone working on that to reach out and tell me about it.
Wikipedia says it looks like the inspiration for Space War was Lensman.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, you just wonder, because there's an oral history of the making of Space War that's like up on some like HTML website from the mid '90s that's still associated with MIT. You can like really dig into the data, and I think it's all cited in my book too. But it is really fascinating to read what those interviews look like. Like what did they care about when they were asking these questions, and so like these connective questions about science fiction are weirdly enough kind of left by the wayside. So. But most of those people are still kicking around, so maybe someone should go do that.
Yeah, internet archaeology is its own really fascinating topic.
Yeah. Oh yeah. It's great. I've yeah, and shout out to the science fiction community in particular, because they are both good at the archaeology and good at maintaining a website from 1996, and like in a raw table format with a bunch of linked image files like that. The amount of just like zines from the 70s that I have found just as 14 scanned pages it's good stuff. Shout out
Yeah.
to the science fiction fans.
Yeah. The previous interview, I interviewed Jim Harris, who maintains the aggregator of science fiction classics,
Oh yeah,
and he got his start in a zine in the 80s that you can still find scan of online.
it's awesome. I love. I'm not a historian, or well, let me say, I was not trained as a historian. Every question that I have in game studies and every question that I've generally had in science fiction studies has required me to become a historian, to the point where I would say that the Magic the Gathering book I'm working on right now is, I don't know, 60% just history, and trying to reconstruct the history of some of the kind of important parts of the game. And you can really feel the difference, to kind of bring it to science fiction. You can really feel the difference between science fiction fandom's desire for preservation and categorization and linearization, right? Of like trying to explain things in sequence. You can really feel that versus me trying to dig through the Usenet archives of, Magic the Gathering discussions from the mid 90s. And sometimes that's easy to do, and sometimes that's not. And there's really no interest in that community, beyond a few kind of critical voices of preserving history. Last year, maybe the year before, recently in the past 24 months, Wizards of the Coast deleted a huge number of articles from the history of the game. I would say the vast majority of articles from the history of the game from their website. And so it's a bummer to go from projects where I'm working on the history of science fiction, where there's lots of people who are invested, and sometimes corporations too, right, who are invested in us remembering what occurred, and then covering a game and a company that is deeply uninterested in memory for reasons that I'm writing about in the book.
And reasons that extend beyond Magic the Gathering. But Wizards of the Coast is something you can find video essays about all the things people are annoyed with them about.
Oh yeah, every day. Every day they do something, right? And the fascinating things that goes all the way back to 1993 or whatever. Like you can read the Usenet archives of people being extremely pissed off in 1995 about things that Wizards continues to today. There's a really interesting corporate culture of maybe anger management over there, or anger assuagement on the part of their fans.
One thing we discussed in the previous episode that I and my co-host at the time weren't all that sure about was just how big is gaming in society? Because I've heard it said that it is bigger than movies.
Yes. Oh, it is. Yeah, the worldwide market, it's in the billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars at this point. But yeah, I mean, it's absolutely massive. If you take gaming to be, a kind of combined market, so looking at mobile games and mobile game time usage in that, yeah, it's substantially larger than any other media form. Part of that has to do with the shape of it, and there's lots of people who have written on this. I'm not an expert on the industry. Africare Kerr has a really great book on this. Actually, 2 books, I believe, on this. And the first one's a little bit older, but it still has all kinds of insights in it that are really, really beneficial if people want to dig up on this. But yeah, so the industry is absolutely massive, and part of the reason it's so massive is because of how internally differentiated it is. So if we think about Sony or we think about Microsoft, these are huge corporations moving money in the billions and hundreds of billions of dollars, and they are not really the largest portion of the industry, which still remains on mobile. But to give some examples, right? So Magic the Gathering this year, which is I would consider to be a huge player in the video game space as well, despite being a tabletop game because of Magic Arena. But Magic is $1 billion brand now, not the last. So 2 Assassin's Creed games ago, Assassin's Creed Valhalla, I think 2 years into its launch, crossed the $1 billion mark just for that game. And so these are just examples that are on the top of my mind because I've been researching these things pretty heavily recently. But yeah, point at a major brand that you're aware of or that you care about, and you're seeing a huge amount of money revolving around. And again, the vast flows of money that are in there probably have more to do with live service games. So your Leagues of Legends and your Dota 2s, and your and mobile games. So Clash of Clans makes a lot of money, like a huge amount of money. And so yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely massive. And the vast majority of people who have access to something that looks like a cell phone or a laptop or anything like it are playing some sort of game, and someone's making money on it somewhere for the most part. So yeah, games are huge, to the point where I would caution basically anyone from talking about games, and I'm making some visual quotation marks here, right? Because it's so huge, it's so differentiated, it is so segmented in its form that whenever you're making a claim about games or what games do or how games work or how games are monetized, you can only ever speak to a portion, and most often not a substantial portion, right? Just a reasonable portion of the industry.
Now, what fraction of that is console gaming?
I don't know. I don't know what the number is. I would say that console gaming is certainly less than 50%, because I believe that 50%, more than 50%, agnostic of company, is mobile gaming. So more than 50% of the worldwide economy of games is happening on mobile. And the last numbers I saw on that are not super new in terms of, I haven't looked up this data since the last time I taught a games course, probably, so a couple years ago. But yeah, I would say that probably console gaming, this is just a round number, please no one quote this number, this is not me coming from it, but I would say console gaming is probably 35 to 40% of the industry worldwide, maybe even less.
And
Yeah.
I feel like this is sort of a difference in perspective between us, because as a non-gamer, for the most part, I still associate gaming and especially quote unquote gamers with console gaming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that's a difference of perspective necessarily. That you're just describing a successful PR maneuver, right? Like, I've read for the Assassin's Creed book in particular, I've read a lot of investor reports, right? And so investor reports are for games companies, particularly Ubisoft. They will say 2 things at one time, right? Which is like, our most successful properties and the properties that are the most marquee are happening on consoles, right? And that's certainly the ones you hear about. Assassin's Creed, right? We've got a new one coming out soon. Console game, console game, console game. And then you look at the numbers, and the revenue does not match to those games necessarily, right? And certainly, one of the things that they measure and they care about is time on device, which is the same thing, the gaming industry, so the gambling industry, what it cares about, which is it is just as valuable for you to spend time on the thing as it is to spend money on the thing. Because time means you can be served ads, you're more likely to make purchases, and most importantly, you're not playing a competitor's product, right? Like, the more time you spend playing Rabbids or whatever, right, or Assassin's Creed, the less time you're doing some other thing in your life or playing some other game. And so that's a metric that they really care about. And so, yeah, the marquee product, I think you're exactly right. The Microsoft wants you to think in terms of PC gaming. and Sony does, and basically or not PC gaming, but console gaming. And that's where the promo money is spent, but the games industry's monetization is happening everywhere all the time, and often in places that they're not promoting because they also don't need to, right? The companies don't the monetization methods on mobile just work very differently and are promoted very differently. And when they've emerged kind of into I don't know, into like human space, right? Or into like the traditional modes. I'm thinking about the Super Bowl commercials that were for Clash of Clans, a few years back. It's weird, it's like that lives on the phone. That lives over there. That's like not a thing that we deal with on the TV screen or whatever. So they're certainly segmented, I think. I think you're exactly right. But I think in terms of money, I think mobile is hugely, hugely, hugely important.
And what I'm getting at here is, again, something we discussed in the previous episode, which is, when I think of mass culture, I think of movies first, because I think if there's one type of media that everyone engages with, it's wide release films.
Yeah.
Whereas, and yes, a lot of people are mobile gamers, maybe even more people are mobile gamers than watch films, but certainly not everyone's a console gamer. So, despite being maybe higher grossing, how much is gaming or console gaming more niche than the broader culture?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, this is also a place where what I was talking about earlier, like when we speak about games or gaming, right? In some ways, the way you've put it there doesn't entirely make sense, if only because of the way that games are segmented, right? Because I'll put a Call of Duty game, the newest Call of Duty game, I'll put it up against every blockbuster that comes out in a year, and we can look and see which is just in terms of time spent playing, in terms of money made, we can see which one is more popular, right? And Call of Duty is going to demolish any given, certainly American domestic box office, going to demolish anything. But I think you're right. Beyond, Call of Duty, there's a drop off, I guess I should say, right? So you've got your kind of AAA blockbuster video games, Call of Duty, Madden, NBA 2K, right? These kind of FIFA, the sports franchises. And then maybe like a Halo game, something like that. And then, I think you've got a pretty substantive drop off where there is a buy-in required, this kind of transformation. And so I would put maybe the top tier video games, right, or the kind of marquee video games up in terms of mass culture. There are lots of people, and this is a market segment, who buy a console to play the new Madden, and then they don't buy a new console until a Madden comes out that they can't play on their old console, right? And that's a big commitment. That's like buying a Blu-ray player or a 4K player to like watch Oppenheimer, and then, well, the next time there's an Oppenheimer, I'll buy a new thing, right? But people put a huge amount of time into it, and those people are heavily monetized, meaning they'll buy the season pass to get map updates. They'll buy skins for the game so they can look like Nicki Minaj or whatever, right? And make their gun shoot different colors. But I do think you're right. You're absolutely right that after that top tier, that most mass commercial tier, something happens, and then everything is seen as kind of a tertiary product of culture, and definitely not perceived. And when it happens, when something jumps from tertiary game culture to mass culture, it's weird when it occurs. So I'm thinking here of Baldur's Gate 3 releasing, last year. And Baldur's Gate 3, I in terms of sales numbers, huge for what it was expected to do, and also kind of broke into mass culture. And by which I mean that there are a lot of people who have never played that game, who have strong opinions on it. They've watched a lot of videos, right? They've watched playthroughs of it, more than the average, single player RPG demographic, would normally kind of lure in. That didn't happen with Pillars of Eternity 2, for lots of different ways. And so it's interesting to see what I would say consider a more niche product erupt out into mass culture, or more mass culture than before. But I do think you're right. And part of that has to do, again, to put my media studies hat on, right? I think part of the thing that you're describing is that that films won a PR war, right? They were part. when Edison is working on film, and Edison does not, invent film, obviously, but Edison's a huge voice in the American version of what film becomes. Edison didn't think it was a mass commercial product. He didn't think you would cram lots of people into a room. He thought everyone would look at them individually, right? Kinetoscopes, I think. It's been a minute since I had to teach film history. And then there's this kind of innovation to say, no, wait, hold on. We don't want to make them for like single use attraction. We want to make them for mass attraction because you can make way more money by cramming 150 people into a theater per showing, right? And you can make these things longer, and you can make them narrative to get people hooked in, and you can invigorate it with genre, right? So people can begin to market segment themselves into different ways they want to engage with these things. And it became mass monetizable with a relatively low startup cost and widely distributed, right? Films are distributed in theaters. You can have a local theater. And so I think we're just, part of the distinction I would make around what you just said in terms of mass culture is that we are downstream from cinema's intervention into what mass culture looks like. And it outlived basically any other mass cultural form. In terms of the ones that existed when it kind of emerged onto the scene. I think there's more local theaters than there are local newspapers, and despite that being the dominant mode of entertainment and communication for a long time before cinema arrived on the scene. I'm not Eric Zimmerman on this issue, who's a kind of a game scholar, a game designer developer. He wrote a manifesto a few years ago. Manifesto for the Ludic Century. His argument is the 2000s, right, up to 2100, it will be defined by radical kind of state change shifts in the way that games dominate our lives and come into their own. I'm not necessarily that person, but I do think that we are part of a big state change. And I don't think that for the next generation, I certainly don't think for the people who are 10 years old right now, I don't think that cinema is going to be their dominant mass culture, even remotely. I mean, look at the summer's blockbuster numbers right now, right? It's looking like the blockbuster is not going to make it out for the next 5-10 years. And I think games don't show any sign of slowing down in any significant way.
To be honest, I haven't been paying attention to movies myself all that much.
You can go see Furiosa?
No. I do feel like blockbusters kind of peaked in 2019 with Avengers Endgame, and there were like $7 or $8 billion films that year. But it's hard to say if the 5 years since then have been, a blip or the start of a trend.
It feels like they're absolutely part of a trend to me. I feel like last year I would have said, yeah, maybe it's a blip, but I think this year's downward tracking numbers. I think people are okay with just not going to a movie theater. And I like a movie theater. Like, it is hugely important to me. It is I would not have gone to graduate school to think about things like film if I did not enjoy, right, like the act of cinema, and the moment of distribution that happens there, right, and the kind of group distribution. Boris Groys has a really excellent essay. It's called like In the Dark of the Theater or something like that, where he describes that when you're in a movie theater, you're trapped, right? Like, you're in there and you gotta watch the thing you're doing because you paid to do it. And there's something freeing or empowering about that moment of just having to give over to it. Even if the movie's not good, you got to find something in it. Or maybe you're having a really bad time, and that's interesting too, is what he argues. But I don't think that many other people feel that way. And teaching students, they certainly don't feel that way. There is no magic to the cinema for them whatsoever. And I'm not saying that to mourn it or something like that. It's just a statement of fact. I'll teach a classroom of 25, 30 students, and I'll ask about the last movie they saw in a movie theater, and they can't tell me. Right? Like that if a bunch of 18-year-olds can't do that, that sounds bad for the movie industry.
Yeah, I think mine was the Marvels.
I mean, I've been going recently, actually. I went and saw Furiosa. I went and saw Killers of the Flower Moon. I saw Oppenheimer twice. I've been going to the movie theater over the past year. Certainly more than any time pre-pandemic. I didn't go, for 3 years or something.
Yeah, but I saw an editorial on CNN a couple months ago. The next time I want to see Timothée Chalamet, I'll do it from the comfort of my couch.
Oof. Oh, I saw Dune 2 as well. I wasn't happy with the film, but I did see that. And I liked seeing Timothy Chalamet big. The movie theater is important because it is big and loud. And I think some movies are meant to be seen big and loud.
Yeah, we've been talking about science fiction,
Yeah.
which, of course, science fiction and fantasy are a big sector of video games. The other ones being shooters and sports games, and there's others in there, but those are probably the largest categories, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, video games are a medium that really lends itself to that because your character often has superhuman abilities.
Hmm.
Even if it's something I guess sports games try to mimic real physics, but even something like a shooter, the physics is not always going to be exactly right unless it's really serious Call of Duty stuff. So, even if it's not fantasy, often the protagonist will be superhuman,
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
and that's not even getting to save points.
Right, right. Or there's just assumptions of games, right? Around the way they work. Yeah. I mean, this is a huge thing, right? Cinema, even the most like post-process effect ridden film, like an Avengers Endgame you mentioned before, right? Like just lots of people standing in the middle distance on the soundstage. Like even those films, right? They are fundamentally tied in some way to the pro filmic, right? The thing that stands in front of the camera, right? We're paying to see a Hemsworth, we're paying to see Scarlett Johansson, and we want to see Mark Ruffalo, be unsure about himself or whatever, right? No one is paying for Call of Duty to see Mark Ruffalo be unsure about himself, right? Like that's like maybe an interesting bonus, right? There is a Call of Duty game from a few years ago that has Kevin Spacey in it, which has aged poorly in 1,000 ways, and just wasn't very good at the time, even. But the thing that's notable about that, right, is as you're pointing out, right, other than sports games, I mean, I think you've got it right in terms of the genre stuff there. But even more than that, right, are genres like the shooter, right? So Call of Duty is a really great example. That franchise is heavily dependent on science fiction. And in fact, the Black Ops series, which is the next Call of Duty coming out this fall, is in the Black Ops series. There's the Modern Warfare series and the Black Ops series, and they kind of bounce back and forth which one gets released which year. And they're highly science fiction oriented. Like Black Ops has historically had exoskeletons and battle suits and kind of far future tech and these kind of speculative weapons that could exist in the world if like certain material advances were made but don't exist now. And they have stealth craft that don't exist in the world, all this kind of stuff, right? So what's even more interesting, I think, about that is that the most dominant games, other than sports again, but the most dominant games, they are all highly inflected by genre. Generally science fiction, but often fantasy as well. And even the games that I would say are the most prestige based, right? So the games that have the artistic I don't know, imprimatur on them, right? This idea that like these are the elevated games. They're all genre games. The God of War franchise, which the last two games have been these kind of deep inflections on fatherhood and responsibility and what does it mean to like be angry and abused in your youth and then grow up and then raise a child and try to not replicate the same systems of harm, right? These things that we associate with in the film world with just the straight drama, right, of the past 50 years. That's all happening in a fantasy video game where you're like beating up Odin, you know what I mean? And like fighting Thor. And similar kind of questions about loss and melodrama that we would associate predominantly with the drama in film, that's happening in places like Destiny 2, this big space opera shooting game. And so, or The Last of Us, right? Which kind of does the full loop, which is The Last of Us video game is essentially a riff on Children of Men in a lot of ways, right? Which is this kind of serious science fiction film, but serious drama that's associated with it, very grounded in terms of what's presented in the film, although obviously has this kind of science fictional reproductive plague problem. So The Last of Us gets made, into a video game. And then The Last of Us gets remade into an HBO series where they kind of recycle all that through to re-transform it into an even more cinematic drama. And I don't think video games are unique in that. If you look at the way that our most I would say the most interesting dramas maybe on television, especially the kind of golden age of television dramas. A lot of them are heavily engaged in genre storytelling, right? Part of The Sopranos even is like, did you know that mobsters could be serious too? They need to go to therapy too, right? There's this kind of diving into the genre form and then pulling something more dramatic out of it in order to kind of prestige it up. True Detective does that. The Wire does that. I think there's a lot of Breaking Bad does that, right? That is just like a straight up like pulp ass crime story. Apologies for my language, but it's one of those, right? And it gets pulled out into being this like long form rumination on the human condition, right? And so I think that video games were both an indicator and highly parasitic to that. Video games kind of showed that you could do it, and they have looked at things like Breaking Bad, like HBO series, in order to say, not only can we do that, we're going to dive even further into it. You can, look at games like Alan Wake 2 recently that really show what you can do with that kind of stuff in the space. So, but yeah, I think you're exactly right. The dominant form of the video game is the science fiction and fantasy video game. And that is actually very odd to me. And I write about this in The World is Born from Zero. It is really, really weird to me that we don't talk about in game studies genre all that much. We talk about the way we interact with the game, the kind of mechanical genre. We talk about the assumptions that are built into it, but we don't talk about Fallout as a science fiction thing and what that means and what it brings to it. It's strangely absent in the history of game studies, and lots of people have been pulling that back. I'm not alone in doing this, but I did make a pretty significant stop in The World is Born from Zero in order to kind of puzzle that out.
And that was a question we had in our previous episode. Does it make more sense to classify video games by traditional genre or by gameplay style?
Yeah, historically in game studies, we have classified them by gameplay style, and I would say that that's changed recently. Tom Apperly has a very famous piece on on genre and how genre works in games. And I would say it's from the early 2000s. And so if it's easy to find. It's like online in various places. And if people are curious about kind of the traditional way that game studies has thought about that, it's a good place to go. But there are lots of us now who are working on genre within video game genre that have complicated that or moved it to some other spots.
And I'd say one area where traditional genre has very much asserted itself is horror games.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then trying to find mechanics, Destiny 2, right? So this kind of space opera, big fantasy, epic fantasy, maybe, or not epic fantasy, but epic science fiction kind of space. It doesn't really spend much time like trying to think of game mechanics that like make things feel like science fiction, right? There's no, I guess there is a summon spaceship button, or a summon speeder bike button. But it is mostly focused on the moment to moment gameplay of shooting things, and everything outside that's kind of tertiary or secondary. But you're right, horror games they have tried to replicate the feeling of distress, helplessness, surprise that science fiction cinema and literature, or not science fiction, but horror cinema and literature, they've tried to replicate that in the space of what you can do. And that often means running away. That often means limited resources. That often means having to avoid enemies rather than take them on. And notably within horror games, it tends to be understood to be a failure of the game if you can just take the thing on head on. Or a climactic moment. So I'm thinking, in the most recent Resident Evil games, and kind of in all Resident Evil games, eventually you get to the point where you just get to shoot the thing with a rocket launcher. And that's like, everyone feels affirmed by that. It's like hopping in the back of the truck at the end of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? There's a victory in using the rocket launcher.
The main question here for the podcast is, how has gaming influenced sci-fi over the years? And you touched on that a little bit. Could you expand on that a bit more?
Yeah, I think that especially over the past couple of years of looking at the Twisted Metal, did you have an opportunity to watch the Twisted Metal TV show for Peacock?
No.
Well, apparently, no one I've talked to has watched it, so you're not alone. I've mentioned this to many people. I'm the only person I know who's seen it. At the same time, it is apparently the most streamed thing ever on Peacock. Still, I mean, it came out last summer, I believe.
Didn't they? Weren't they the ones that did Foundation?
No, that was Apple
Oh
Plus.
yeah, that was
Apple
Apple.
did it. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and so it apparently for Peacock standards, very popular, but no one I know has seen it. No one I've ever talked to, other than me. So it's really, really odd. But there's that, and there's Fallout, and both of those have been really clarifying to me. And Fallout came out with Amazon Studios recently. Both of those have been very clarifying to me about the way that video game narrative structure and has heavily influenced episodic TV structure. And once I've watched those, which are people trying to adapt video game properties into the episodic structure of TV, and it's seamless. It works really easily. And part of it is that I think that for TV production, particularly genre TV production, we have regressed is not the right word, but we have time traveled back to like the sci-fi television TV shows of like the late 90s and early 2000s. Meaning that we are very happy to like have a 10 episode series where we have like 2 that get the plot started, 4 that have monster of the weeky kind of stuff, and then we're back to the plot again. Like that is the way these genre TV shows and these video game adaptations work. And now that I've put that in my mind, I see it everywhere. And I think that something has happened, and I think this happens all the way back actually with the first season of True Detective, with the episode where he's going through the housing project, which plays like a video game. It's 100% a third-person video game camera setup. I think something has happened where the aesthetics and narrative structures of games have seeped into television writing in particular in a very influential way that has only surfaced recently, or surfaced visually recently. And I don't know really what to do about that. And I don't know if that is unique to genre properties in any kind of way, right? I think maybe that could be true in lots of ways, but I think it has to do with shrinking writers' rooms. I think it has to do with what the cultural references of the people who get into TV writing are, and I think a lot of those people are, they're indoor kids. You know what I mean? Like they're people who spent a lot of summers playing video games and watching like old comedy television. And look, I did both of those things too. That's like a big part of my life. And so I think that the structure, more than anything else, more than the visual stuff, more than the characterization, more than anything of that, I think the structure of video game narrative has seeped into the thing. The flip side of that, the other side of that maybe is even more media industries focused, is that the richest people on the planet are big nerds now. Right? Like that's just true. And the people who have money to spend on extraneous things, special collector's items, objects, things like that, they're big nerds, right? The tech boom happened and it caused a categorical shift in where money lived, right? It moved from a one type of professional class to another type of professional class. The Expanse got picked up by Amazon because Jeff Bezos is a big nerd and he wanted to see him keep making it. And so it moved over and they acquired it, right? I don't think any of those Apple, the Apple TV or the Apple Plus, whatever it is, right? I don't think any of those big science fiction shows get made without there being a kind of tech and investor class of big nerds who want to see interesting science fiction showing up on the screen and have the capacity and influence in the industry in order to make that happen. So I think that's part of it. I think that the transformation of the American specific professional class really made that kind of transition, and part of their set of influences and references in the world among science fiction literature are also video games, especially 80s and early 90s video games. So that's a big weird composite answer for you, but I think it's coming from a lot of places.
Yeah, I find that interesting what you said about the structure, because I associate the 90s and early 2000s with the older model of 20 episode seasons that were mostly episodic, like with Star Trek, the early Stargate, that sort of thing. Whereas late 2000s into the 2010s is where you get, and of course on streaming, but it started before streaming, where you get the 10 episode seasons that have a much stronger narrative arc. That's where you get Fringe in its later seasons. That's where you get Defiance, Stargate Universe, that sort of thing.
Yeah. No, I think I think it's just met in the middle. So watching, have you seen the Fallout show yet?
No.
So it just does both. And maybe that has to do with having the full hour runtime. But I think it's a combination of streaming economics, right? So make fewer, release them all at one time. It creates a big splash when it comes out and then kind of fades until the next season. But yeah, I think it's 10 episodes or something like that, 10 or 12. No, it's 8. I want to say it's 8 actually. So really tightly done, and has an A plot and a B plot and a C plot of major characters. But in terms of what's occurring in the episodes, feels very much like I'm watching like an episode of Xena, which is like, I think I'm on my quest, but there's a thing in the way, and now I gotta like go over here and like meet these zany kooky characters that are gonna show up for one episode, and then I gotta come back. It's a very odd kind of thing, and this is in terms of, because these things are intertwined, right? Video game narrative in those early 2000s moments, I think, are heavily, heavily influenced by those television shows from the late 90s, the genre heavy television shows, and then the early 2000s. And so video game narrative for a long time is that we have our big quest, what we're doing. Now we have to go to like the ice world to figure that out. We got to go to the fire world to figure that out. I'm thinking about like a Jack and Daxter style game, or a Ratchet and Clank. And like that stuff eventually gets pushed aside by the open world video game, which doesn't, now you don't have to have discrete spaces where characters move through. It's just one big map, and part of the thing that gets sold there is not narrative progression, but humans entertaining themselves with their own devices. So there's a little bit of a transformation there, but I think that playing maybe the apex of that narrative style in like The Last of Us, right? Doing that and then comparing it to the TV show of a decade before, and then looking at TV now, there's a weird set of confluences that I think you're right. Those things were different, but they've found ways to fold a lot of that in, a lot of those kind of structural conceits back in, that makes an 8-episode series like Fallout feel weirdly inflated while also being 8 episodes long, and feel like it has a lot of detours, despite, again, only being 8 episodes long. How many detours could it have? And Twisted Metal has a very similar kind of structure to it too. So I don't know. I think it's going to shake out in interesting ways. We've now had, with The Last of Us TV show and Fallout, we've had 2 massive, 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 massive successes of video game adaptations in the TV. And by all metric accounts, despite the fact that, again, I can't find anyone who has actually seen it other than myself, in terms of metrics, Twisted Metal did the same thing. I mean, it blew up numerically and so we've had 3 huge successes there. And I think that there's going to be a real strong desire to figure out how you can pull more of that in. And I think more video game structure is going to enter into the other parts of visual culture because of that heavy influence. And I think partially the developers and producers and showrunners and writers behind those projects, part of the reason you're adapting something as opposed to making something original, is that you want to bring the fan base in, right? You gotta get this kind of parasitic relationship to the original object as a built-in audience. And so I think there's going to be more concessions to video game structure, or more influenced by that. And I'm very curious about what that looks like. Eventually someone will go too far and will make a thing everyone hates, and it will be genuinely interesting to look at because it's gone too far. And that's what I'm waiting on. I'm waiting on, the I don't know, like the Battletoads TV series, right? That just like is way off the map and like, visually says level 1, 2 every time the scene changes. That's what I'm looking. I'm waiting for the bad pandering.
Yeah, and then of course there are sci-fi works that commentate on video games and extrapolate on video games. Ready Player One's probably the most famous these days, but there are plenty of others.
Yeah. Ender's Game, right? Still looms large, I think, around all that stuff. Yeah, I'm sure that there's literature in particular, right? Kind of like textual objects of the current moment that are doing that, but I can't name any of them, and that's interesting to me. Right? Like there are none that that I'm thinking of the kind of major science fiction work of the past 5 years that I'm aware of, and certainly nothing that like hit the awards circuit that really thinks about video games. Which I wonder, is there, and maybe that's just my ignorance, right? Like I'm not saying that as a definitive statement, but I just can't come up with a title. And I do wonder if it's like what you're saying, that Ready Player One displaced some of that, that maybe that's like not a thing that is people are interested in.
Yeah, that or it's kind of moved on to AI.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe it's just not a shiny object anymore. But I also do wonder, maybe is it the banality of games at this point too, right? Which is like they're
Hmm.
everywhere and they're pervasive, in the way that cyberspace is not really, essential, in the cyberpunk imagination of cyberspace embodied being in an internet space. That's not really a central function of science fiction right now. And maybe it's because it's here in some ways. The other thing I would say about that too is that the lit RPG phenomenon has also maybe eaten some of that, which is that people just write books that are narrativizations of people playing fake video games and like killing level 2 goblins and working their way up a level ladder, right? Like it could be that the labor form of games has eaten the science fiction imaginary. And look, if there are people who are listening to this that have like interesting books from the past 5 years that have been thinking about video games that I just don't know about, please send them my way. Like I'm on Twitter, easy to find. Please let me know, because I'm very curious. But it does feel like that was such a major thing for so long in science fiction, and it has kind of died out. And I don't really know what to do with it, other than I guess you can go play science fiction video games now.
Now, would you say there are any particular signposts of sci-fi games over the history that have been especially influential to the genre?
Yeah, definitely. So Deus Ex is probably the, if not the landmark, I would say it's hugely influential. Kind of a near future cyberpunk story. Kind of instantiates, or it's one of the early instantiations of the immersive sim game. So the idea of, this is a world with a bunch of rules to it, and you can navigate those rules however you want. You can kind of figure that out. You can be stealthy, you can be in combat, you can have combinations of those things. Enemies can be distracted or have patterns that you can dodge around. Once you can master the space, then you can kind of interact with it however you want to. And it had a very kind of conspiracy theory, very 90s conspiracy theory, big government conspiracy narrative behind it, combined with some like near future cybernetic stuff. And so I would say, if we're just like throwing a dart at the wall, Deus Ex is hugely influential there. At one point I was writing a piece on the history of games in science, or history of science fiction games, and I stalled out on it. I just could not complete it. And it wasn't because it was like impossible to write. And I, when I said I couldn't do it, I told the editor I was working with, I was like, look, I feel confident someone else can do it. I just can't. But I was absolutely paralyzed by the idea of trying to find the high water marks, and express why they were important. And I got locked up talking about the original Metroid, which is undeniably a science fiction game. There's no question, right? You're in a spacesuit, a little power suit, shooting aliens, right? There's no, but as I wrote, I just kind of kept getting deeper and deeper into the one object of like, why is it significant and why is it important and why does it express something that matters about science fiction games? And I realized I had written 2,500 words about a single game, and then I had to like continue writing the piece. And so like one of the only times I've ever written an academic piece and experienced such distress while doing it that I just had to like kind of kick out of it. Which is to say, the question you've asked is very hard. But I would say Deus Ex like is always immediately top of mind, and it's 25 years into science fiction games, right? It's not originary in any kind of way, but I would say it's deeply influential. There is a book, Neil Tringham wrote a book called Science Fiction Video Games a few years ago. And I would encourage anyone who is interested in this kind of question of like, what are the high watermarks, to check that book out. It's not really an argumentative book. It's more encyclopedic. And it's just trying to walk through all the science fiction games that existed up to that point, which is like 2007 or something like that. So I guess it's more than a few years ago that came out. But if you're someone who is interested on especially the kind of pre-2010s what are the major works of science fiction games. It's an incredibly useful resource. I really strongly encourage people to check that out.
To wrap it up, one final question, which is similar but not quite the same. Do you have any games that you would recommend to someone who's trying to get into gaming from a sci-fi perspective?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So I think there are a couple that are both easy and foundational, which I think are both important, right? So one, you can go with a good old fashioned Bioshock. Bioshock is in the kind of Deus Ex lineage. It's a game that takes you down into an objectivist, like a Randian utopia built beneath the ocean, and it is now a dystopia because it's fallen apart. And so you kind of comb through the wreckage to find out what happened and to whom. And it's a little bit of a horror game, a lot of a science fiction game. It is really interesting, and you can put that thing on easy and get through it, and maybe turn it up a little bit if you're feeling more like that. I would encourage people also to check out the Halo trilogy, which is extremely easy to get access to. It's available on PC. It's available on any Xbox console that you could reasonably get your hands on. And I would encourage you to play 1, 2, and 3. They are good old-fashioned space opera kind of things. The first game is about the Master Chief, who's on a big ring world, like a Larry Niven-style ring world, and he's trying to figure out what it's about and what's going on with it, what's up with this precursor species. And then the second game really turns into actual space opera kind of stuff, because it becomes about the Master Chief and this guy called the Arbiter, who's a part of a thing called the Covenant, which is this giant alien species kind of civilization religion that has all this internal politicking involved in it. And so you play two stories kind of parallel to one another about someone from the humans and someone from the Covenant kind of coming into contact with one another. And then Halo 3 kind of takes all that to a big climax and conclusion. And again, if you're uncomfortable with games or whatever, you can put that thing on easy and you can experience, I think, a really interesting and very confident and competent science fiction story. And if you're more in the RPG world, or you want to do some role playing, or you're more comfortable with that, Mass Effect, the original Mass Effect trilogy has a thing called the Legendary Edition now that sometimes goes on sale for $10. And I think full price it's only 40 or 50. That's 3 games. It's easily more than 200 hours of gameplay if you want it to be, but it can probably be 40 or 50 if you just want to get through it. And it's good old fashioned space epic kind of stuff. Your humans have just been entered into a kind of, I don't know, grand council of alien species in the galaxy. We've just kind of been quote unquote uplifted. It's one of those kind of stories. And you are the first human agent from a kind of special forces within that, who is trying to figure out why one rogue agent from that special forces thing is going around doing bad stuff. And that eventually goes up to galaxy-wide, repercussions. And so you've got characters that stick around through all 3 stories, and narrative lines. You can import your save from game to game, so your decisions stick around. And the third game is really cool because there are decisions you can make midway through game 1 that have major repercussions halfway through game 3, and that's pretty neat. So all of those are fairly old, 10 plus years old. That means they're going to run on anything. So if you have something that you can listen to a podcast on, I feel pretty confident you can find a way to play any of those, and they're all pretty cheap. So those are my big recommendations.
Okay. Cameron Kunzelman, thank you again for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major podcasting platforms. If you like this podcast and want to support it, you can consider joining my Patreon at Science Meets Fiction. Episodes go up there 1 week in advance for patrons. You can find my other work on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter, Mastodon, and Blue Sky at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. In the next episode, I will be airing yet another interview with one of the greats of science fiction history. I recently had the opportunity to interview Larry Niven, and that will go up in 2 weeks. This is a big one, so be sure to tune in for that. And as always, thanks for listening.